All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us for the very first Dig Your Dinner of 2026. We're excited to be here. If you're familiar with this series, you know the run of show by now. But if you're unfamiliar, we are joined today by myself, Anthony Reardon. I'm the Horticulture Small Farms Extension Agent for Johnson County, which means that I work with local food systems and helping to enhance our local food system through horticulture education. Chelsea King is also here. She is our nutrition and food safety and health agent, and she will be jumping in here in a while to talk about the whole nutrition and cooking aspects of our topic today. But we also have a special presenter with us today, and that is Ryan Engel. He is the horticulture agent for the Golden Prairie District in Western Kansas. I believe it's in the Ellis area. He may have to correct me on that. But Ryan is an experienced beekeeper who is much more well versed in beekeeping than I am. So I have asked him to come in and step in my place today to speak on kind of just the basics of beekeeping and lead us into our topic of homegrown honey. So, with that, Ryan, I will let you take it over.
All right. Thank you guys. Let me share my screen here. Hopefully that's working there. Yeah, again, my name is Ryan Engel. I'm the horticulture extension agent with Golden Prairie District. My office is in Waukene, so out on the western side of the state. And yeah, I'm happy to be here talking to you guys today about something that I'm kind of passionate about. I really love to talk about honeybees and honey any chance I get. So I hope that you guys enjoy some of this information today. I was going to start by talking just a little bit about honey. I think Chelsea's going to go more in depth on this. I just want to say, broadly speaking, and some of this might be kind of obvious, but honey is produced solely by honeybees. So there are a few other insects that produce something kind of similar to honey, but basically, by definition, the only creatures out there that make honey are honeybees. And there are a few different species of them across the world. But of course, honey is made from nectar gathered from flowers. So kind of looking at this progression of images here, you have a foraging bee. They travel out to these flowers, they collect nectar. Excuse me. They bring that nectar back to the hive, and with the help of some enzymes and evaporation, they essentially create honey. And one of the really cool things about honey is the diversity. There's a lot of different kinds, different flavors of honey. And really, the reason for that is because the nectar of each flower species is unique and distinct. So, what I mean by that is the nectar that sunflowers produce is different than the nectar that, say, lavender produces. So, just to kind of drive that point home, different flowers produce different types of nectar, which ultimately then results in a different type of honey. So, we see just this really wide range of very light honeys, just all different colors, all different flavors, different aromas. It's fun. And just to highlight a few kind of common types of honey that you'll see occasionally. Clover honey, especially in the state of Kansas, we produce a lot of clover honey. Alfalfa is pretty popular too. Um, you might see wildflower honey. Wildflower honey is a little more diverse, generally because it's kind of just a mix of different wildflowers. But it just ranges. Something like buckwheat honey is typically really pretty dark in color, pretty bold in its flavor, almost malty. I mean, some people don't necessarily even love the flavor of it, but this is really fun if you guys have time and can find some of these different types of honey. I definitely recommend that you try some of them, sample them. It's cool to see the diversity there. But I wanted to shift gears and talk a little bit about honey production, kind of from the beekeeper's perspective. What are we doing to, I guess, raise bees and produce honey? So I wanted to start with kind of getting started, for somebody who may not be keeping bees yet, but is looking at starting. One of the first things we want to think about is where are we going to place a colony? The cool thing about honeybees is that they're extremely versatile and you can place, like, keep honeybees virtually anywhere. So, looking at this image here, this beekeeper's up on a high rise in a large urban area, and those bees will probably perform just fine there. It's amazing how good they are at going out and finding the resources that they need. The one thing that I did want to say is you should be sure to check any city laws or ordinances. And it's tough for me to give recommendations here because the policies or the rules are different everywhere you go. I did try to look before this presentation. I believe in Mission, there are some rules where you're required to have like an accessory animal permit per hive. But it just varies. So, the recommendation here is if you are looking at keeping bees, look into your local policy on that. Some of them require hives be placed certain distance from property lines. Some of them may place a cap on how many hives you can have in a city. So just look into that if you guys are, looking at getting started there. But just a few general recommendations. It's a good idea to kind of keep bees in a somewhat secluded area, away from human or animal disturbance. And, I think this is kind of just good general advice. Be respectful of your neighbors. There are a lot of people who are uncomfortable around honeybees, and that's totally okay. So, I think just kind of keeping them in a secluded area is going to be beneficial. Keeping a source of water nearby can also be helpful. So this is one kind of common issue that can happen in urban areas where, say, your neighbor has some sort of a water feature. Your bees might be traveling to that water feature to utilize it. So keeping your own source of water nearby can help to kind of mitigate some of that. Of course, you want an abundance of flowering plants. That's always going to be good for our pollinators. And thinking about protection from winter winds can be beneficial too when you talk about where you're placing a colony. So, if you guys want more information about getting started, if you're new to beekeeping, I really want to point you in the direction of a past garden hour that we had done. So, this, you can find it on YouTube, just beekeeping basics, how to start your own colony. And the reason why this is really catered towards the beginner, somebody who is not familiar with bees, not yet started the hobby. We kind of cover some of the equipment needed, the associated costs with that, where to find honeybees and how to install them in that new equipment. So I recommend if you're wanting to learn more to check this out. But again, today I want to kind of talk about we have to be kind of broad. We don't have a ton of time and there's a lot involved in beekeeping. So I'm kind of keeping this surface level and we're definitely looking at it from a honey production standpoint. So I'm going to make a few general broad statements, but just follow me here. In general, healthy bees with good weather and a good location will generally yield surplus honey. And when I say surplus honey, I mean enough for the beekeeper to harvest. So those bees are going to produce honey for themselves to overwinter, but typically, if we can add these things up, we as the beekeeper then are fortunate enough to be able to have some of that honey as well. And some of this stuff is out of our control, but like things like healthy bees, we want to focus on like a few best management practices where these management practices are kind of focused on enhancing or supporting things like nutrition, swarm management, pest control. These are going to contribute to the health of our bees. So, of course, honeybees utilize nectar, as I had mentioned earlier, but they also need pollen. So, as beekeepers, we want to be monitoring the stores of nectar and pollen in those colonies to make sure that they're healthy and they have what they need. As beekeepers, we also want to manage for swarms, and some of you guys may be familiar with what a swarm is. Maybe you've seen them before. It's pretty amazing, but a swarm essentially is when a portion, sometimes up to like half of the individuals in the colony, will leave the hive and not return to go start a new colony elsewhere. So if we're talking about making surplus honey, that's definitely going to have an impact on our honey yields. I mean, maybe a good way to think about it is if you had a factory full of workers and one day half of them stood up and walked out, not to return, productivity is definitely going to take a hit there. So we want to manage for swarms as beekeepers. And finally, we want to control for pests. I'm sure you guys have probably heard some about this. It's definitely had its fair share of media coverage over the past decade or so. pests are pretty problematic with honeybees, and we want to have a plan in place to help, again, keep healthy bees. Of course, there's not much we can do about the weather, and Kansas is a crazy place for that, so we roll with the punches, but we can focus on where we place our honeybees. So we want to make sure to locate our colonies in suitable habitat. And, again, they can perform well in a wide range of habitats, but if we can find, dense stands of flowering plants, it's going to be really helpful. So this top image here is an image. This was taken nearby Hays, Kansas, and it's a field of yellow sweet clover. And yellow sweet clover is just a fantastic honey producing plant. It just produces a lot of nectar. And I will say the beehives that were on this property, they did extremely well. They produced a lot of honey, and it can make a difference, habitat. That's for sure. But when we talk about honey yields, they are variable. In the first year, if you're starting your own colony, I would not expect to harvest honey. It's not impossible, but really we want to focus on comb building, have them draw that wax out and really kind of get established. After that first year, when you have a more established colony in the state of Kansas, again, this is variable, but I would say a reasonable estimate on yields would be around 50 pounds of honey per hive. Now, that's what the beekeeper is harvesting as well. So those colonies are actually producing a lot more honey than that. But yeah, around 50 pounds is what from year to year a beekeeper could potentially harvest off of an established colony. So again, as I said, I'm kind of making these general, really broad statements and kind of keeping this somewhat simple. But when we think about honey production, the goal of the beekeeper is to kind of have these large, healthy colonies during peak nectar flows. So I want to draw your guys' attention to this chart here, where we're kind of talking about the typical beekeeping seasonal cycle. Hopefully you guys can see my mouse, but this time of year, January, February, those bees are in dormancy. Oh, and I should point out, this dark line here is indicating colony population. So how many individual bees are in the colony? So again, January, February, these bees are essentially dormant. Our colony populations are low. They're almost as low as they're going to be, as they'll ever be throughout the span of the entire year. But right around February, late February, early March, we have some of our first sources of pollen become available. Shortly after that, that colony is going to build up in population, reaching its peak somewhere around, typically around mid-June, we're going to reach peak colony population. Shortly after the summer solstice, that population is going to begin to decline. And as we get into the summer and fall months, that population is just going to drop off and they'll enter that period of dormancy again. And again, the reason why I want to bring this up is our goal is to have these large, healthy colonies during peak nectar flows. And typically, our peak nectar flows run somewhere from May to probably the first part or maybe mid-July. And when I say peak nectar flows, I just mean we have the greatest abundance of flowers out there in bloom at one time where these bees can really capitalize on those resources when they're present and available. So again, having large, healthy colonies during peak nectar flows. And I'm going to kind of continue to point out some of these or use this cycle as reference as we talk about some of this stuff. So there's a few things we can do as beekeepers to kind of ensure that we're going to have these large colonies at the proper time. One thing we want to do is we want to support spring colony growth. So there's a few ways we can do that as beekeepers. We could feed syrup or protein, so we could kind of supplement their diet. And this is really important in years where we have cool, wet springs. So if you see on this cycle here, there's this thing they're labeling a nectar dearth. And this can be, again, caused by poor foraging conditions, poor weather, where those bees can't get out and forage as much as they want to. So if we provide supplemental feed or nutrition at that time, we can kind of help this build up along. Another thing we want to do is ensure that our queen is healthy and that she has good brood patterns. So this is just a fancy word or term for she is vigorous. She's laying a lot of eggs and that colony is going to build up properly. So if for some reason we inspect a colony and we see problems, we're not seeing a lot of eggs, we're not seeing a lot of young bees being raised, we as beekeepers can go in and actually re-queen that colony where we pull that old queen out and we place a new, younger queen who is going to be more vigorous in that colony. Again, we're just focusing on building up that population in the spring. As I mentioned earlier, another thing we want to do is we want to control for swarms. So this picture, this is kind of crazy here, and it happens, but this isn't necessarily good for the beekeeper. I'm not sure that it really harms the bees at all, but if we're, managing a hive for honey production and all these bees exit the hive, fly off and leave, it's definitely going to have an impact on our productivity. So there's a few things that we can do to control for this. What a lot of people will do, well, I guess I'll mention adding boxes first. As this colony population is building up, we want to add boxes, whether it's hive bodies or honey supers, to kind of account for that population growing. So one thing that stimulates swarming is those bees will run out of room inside of a hive, and that kind of causes them to want to swarm. So as beekeepers, if we can stay ahead of that and provide boxes in a timely manner and kind of expand the real estate that they have, we're accommodating for that spring buildup. Another thing that we can do is something called splits. So a lot of beekeepers will perform splits, and a split is when a beekeeper would go into a hive, kind of during this springtime, early summertime, remove a portion of the frames with the bees on them and place them in a new box. So I think a good analogy for this is kind of like taking a perennial that you might have out in your garden. It grows for a few years. You can go out there, dig it up, split it, and you create new plants from that mother plant. That's essentially what a split is in the honeybee world as well. So this is beneficial for the beekeeper because it cuts down on the likelihood of swarms, but it also helps beekeepers to grow their apiary, to grow their operation and multiply their hives. And the last thing, and this is kind of a season-long task, we want to monitor and control for pests. We want to have some sort of management plan in, I guess, a plan for that. So I was just going to touch on honeybee pest management because it is important, but really this is probably beyond the scope of our conversation today. An entire presentation could be given about this. Again, there are a lot of honeybee pests out there. I have three of them listed here. This is by no means all inclusive. There are other pests and diseases. Varroa mites are probably the most notorious pest currently in the honeybee world. There are also tracheal mites and small hive beetles as well that can be problematic. I believe these small hive beetles would actually be more problematic for beekeepers in your guys' area out in the eastern portion of the state. I think they like that increased precipitation. I don't think we see them quite as much out on the western side of the state. Ultimately, though, I think it's important that we take an integrated pest management approach to this, an IPM approach. And really that's going to start with identifying and understanding the pest and monitoring. This is a season-long thing where we need to be on the lookout, scouting for signs of these pests to just kind of stay ahead of the problem. But of course, if you've seen any of these IPM pyramids before, we're going to really lean on these things. We can employ or utilize some cultural control methods. So things like using resistant genetics, disease or pest resistant bees, small cell comb, using brood breaks. Some physical and mechanical control methods would be like physically trapping some of these mites or using screened bottom boards. And as we work up, we might need to think about utilizing biological control or chemical control when we cross the certain pest thresholds. Ultimately, I think, a sound pest management plan is going to include some combination of all of these things. I wanted to kind of, as we're wrapping up my portion of this, I wanted to talk a little bit about actually how honey is harvested. Um, so, of course, we want to be sure that we leave enough honey on the hive for the colony to overwinter. And in Kansas, that's going to be around 80 to 100 pounds, which is it's a lot of honey. I think further to the south, they get away with leaving less honey on some of those hives. But again, we want to make sure they have enough to where they can overwinter successfully. And when we do harvest, we want to be sure to harvest only ripe honey. And believe it or not, there is ripe and unripe honey. And the bees kind of tell us when that is the case. So, what we're looking for, ultimately, the moisture content of that honey should be somewhere around 18%, ideally, maybe a little less. And the bees kind of know when that is the case because what they will do when that honey is ripe is they will actually, if you see in this picture here, they will place a wax capping over that cell when the honey is ripe. So if you look in this top picture here on the periphery, that honey is ripe. It's at the proper moisture content where it's going to be shelf stable. It's going to last. And this honey that's still open and uncapped probably still has just a little bit too much moisture in there, so it's not quite ready. Um, as a rule of thumb, what we're kind of looking for as beekeepers when we're harvesting is we're looking for around 90% or greater of the cells on the frame to be capped like this picture here. That moisture content can also be verified by using a refractometer. And when we're ready to harvest, it's really a pretty straightforward process. We remove those honey frames from the hive, and then we're going to utilize a tool to uncap them to get rid of that wax capping. There are multiple different tools out there to do this. A lot of people will use a hot knife, and I'm not sure if this video works, but if it does, it's kind of satisfying. That knife is just warm. It's slid over the tops of those frames, and it just removes the very surface, those wax cappings, and exposes that honey inside those cells there. After we've uncapped those cells, we're going to place those frames in an extractor. It's just a big device that spins. And we use centrifugal force to kind of kick that honey out of the frames, and it will settle in the bottom of that extractor. After, we'll typically strain or filter to remove any contaminants, and that's just things like maybe pieces of wax that made it into the honey, and then we can go ahead and bottle that honey. So I wanted to close today just by sharing a few fun facts, and there's definitely not a shortage of these when we talk about honeybees, but one cool thing is honey can last indefinitely. So it's been found in Egyptian tombs, and it's still believed to be edible. Um, it takes around 2 million flower visits to make 1 pound of honey. So think about that the next time you buy just a jar of honey. It's amazing the work that they do. A large honeybee colony can contain up to 80,000 bees. So one of the more fascinating aspects about honeybees is that social aspect, the way they work together. Really, it's just amazing the more you learn about them. And the last one I have is drone bees or males don't work in the hive, they don't gather food, and they don't defend the hive. They're solely there to mate. And one interesting fact is actually commonly in the winter, they're actually kicked out of the hive before winter fully sets in because they're not actually contributing to the overwintering success of those colonies. So just something kind of cool there. If you guys found today's presentation interesting, or no, I guess I wanted to share, or promote an upcoming K-State Garden Hour that we have. So I'll be talking about honeybee colony management and key floral resources in the state of Kansas. That presentation will be on Wednesday, February 4th from 12 to 1. So if you know anybody who might be interested, please spread the word and hope to see a good turnout for that. I wanted to share just a few additional resources if you guys were looking for some information. Just a quick Google search of any one of these. These would be valuable for any beekeeper in the state of Kansas. There's good, just general beekeeping information there. And I strongly recommend if you're a newer beekeeper looking at getting involved, look into some of the beekeeping clubs. I think that that is probably by far one of the best ways to learn. In your guys' area, you have the Northeastern Kansas Beekeepers Association. Definitely look into them. And just another statewide beekeeping association, the Kansas Honey Producers Association. Definitely worth looking into. And it's nice to network and learn from people who have done it for a little while. So I've got contact information here. If you guys have any questions at all regarding honeybees, please feel free to reach out. And I guess I can take any questions, or Anthony, you can jump in however you want to handle it.
Sure. Do we have any questions for Ryan? Feel free to unmute or throw your questions to the chat. Well, Ryan, we thank you so much for being here. If you want to unshare your screen, we'll go ahead and throw it over to Chelsea and
You bet.
go into the second half of this.
Thank you, guys.
You do have one question that just popped up here.
What do you got? I don't see
Is it
it.
is it true that wasps can wipe out a bunch of bees?
Yeah, and there was that killer hornet scare that we had a few years ago where I think they may have made it into Washington State. I don't believe that wasps, at least the wasps that we have around here, are typically very problematic. There are some insect predators. I've seen praying mantises, assassin bugs, things like that, sitting outside of hives that I've had before that will occasionally pick off a few bees. I don't know how actually severe or problematic they are, but yeah, there are some predators out there.
So along those lines, do you have much issues with wildlife interfering with your boxes?
You know, I, I would say no, typically no. And I referenced kind of secluding bees away from livestock. So some people will keep bees in like a pasture. I think it's wise to put up like cattle panels or something, just so those hives don't get knocked over. Um, but really, mice can occasionally be a problem. There are mouse guards that are typically put on hives shortly before kind of fall sets in because occasionally a mouse can move into some of those colonies and cause some damage. But yeah, there are definitely ways to prevent that and things that we manage for as beekeepers.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you again, Ryan, so much for your time, and we'll
Yeah,
throw it over to Chelsea.
thank you guys.
All right. Well, if more questions come up for Ryan, do put them in the chat. We'll have time at the end of my portion to answer any remaining questions that you might have. My name is Chelsea King, and I am the Nutrition, Food Safety, and Health Agent here in Johnson County for K-State Extension. I'm going to talk a little bit about honey and the nutrition benefits, why people might choose to consume it, and also some other considerations when you're using it in the culinary world. So to get started, as Ryan kind of talked about, honey is produced by the honeybees, and really it's enjoyed across the globe. It's not just something that's here in the US. There's honeybees obviously all over the globe. And as Ryan said, right, the types of flowers and the type of pollinations and the type of nectar that they use can vary from different regions across the globe. Worldwide, about 1,800 metric tons of honey are produced, and the market is just expected to grow by 2028. Interesting, China produces about 28% of the global market, followed by Turkey and Iran, and then the US market is about a 4% share. So, again, point being that honey is really produced all over the globe. So, if you've had honey in different parts of the world, it may taste different than what we have here in Kansas because of the type of plants and natural resources that are available to the bees. So, what's the deal with honey? Is it nutritious or is it not nutritious? Um, there's a lot of information out there, and there is research that does show that honey does have some beneficial effects. There is research that shows that it is rich in antioxidants, which from our previous talks that you've had, if you joined us from previous Dig Your Dinners, is we've talked about antioxidants being kind of those scavenger components that really help to protect our cells and keep our cells nice and healthy. Honey has been shown to have anti-inflammatory properties, antibacterial, and antiviral properties. So all of those have been researched, and more research is being done to look at that component as that interest in honey as a food and as kind of a natural herbal remedy, if you will, increases. So we know that honey is rich in phenolic compounds, which are those antioxidants and really what protects our cells from damages from the sun to the foods we eat to even exercise kind of causes some internal damage to our body as our cells are being worked. So we need to consume foods that are rich in antioxidants and these phenolic compounds. The honey does contain a primary source of our sugar. So at about 80 to 85% of the weight of the honey is made of sugar. And then, as Ryan mentioned, that honey, in terms of making it consumable and shelf stable, needs to be less than 18%. So that's typically in that 10 to 17% range. And then there is a very small amount of that protein. And then, of course, we have enzymes, vitamins, and minerals. So the nutrition profile of honey, we know that 1 tablespoon of honey is 61 calories, 17 grams of carbohydrates, 0 grams of protein, 0 grams of fiber, and contributes a small amount of our vitamins and mineral at 1% of our daily value. Now, it is important to note that this is not a low-calorie food. 1 tablespoon is not that much when we think about consumption. So, although honey does have some nutrition benefits, we don't want to rely on it as our primary source of vitamins, minerals, protein, antioxidants, all of those things, because it is higher in calories and it is a higher sugar food because it's pretty much straight 80 to 85% of that is sugar. So that is important to note that although it can have some nutrition components, it really should not be a primary source. We don't want to be getting riboflavin and copper from our honey. We want to be getting it from our other fruits and vegetables and plants that we're eating. There is research that shows that darker varieties tend to offer more of the antioxidants compared to the lighter versions, just like what we've talked about in the past with the color of our fruits and vegetables, that typically the darker the fruit or vegetable, the more antioxidants and nutrition that it has from that point of the antioxidant scape. So kale has more antioxidants and a little bit more nutrition than, say, your basic head of lettuce. So keeping that in mind. The health benefits of honey, there is, again, lots of research that is showing the health benefits of honey. Now, the hard thing with health benefits when we look at research in terms of food, it is very hard sometimes to isolate what specifically may be the contributing factor. But all that to say that there has been shown some potential benefit impact on things like your cardiovascular health, on blood sugar regulation, on your lipid profiles, which is your heart healthy kind of cholesterol, and then mucitis symptoms. So again, that mucus, upper respiratory tract infections in children. There's a reason that cough drops sometimes have honey in them, and it's because it can kind of soothe that upper respiratory tract and when we have infection. And then it also has been looked at wound healing and that beneficial impact from all those antioxidants, antimicrobial, and antiviral that it has. However, more research is definitely needed on the potential positive health effects of honey. As I mentioned, they may be there, but the quantity of how much you might need to consume really probably won't outweigh the benefit of how much sugar and all the other kind of added calories that you're going to be consuming. Your body does process honey the same way it processes other sugars. This is a common question I get. Is honey healthier for me than my refined table sugar? And the truth is that your body is smart, but it's not quite that smart to know that honey is a little bit different than your refined sugars. Now, there is a slightly different composition of your sucrose and fructose in your honey versus your regular white table syrup or white table sugar. However, really your body is going to process it quite the same. Now, as I mentioned, honey does have a little bit more of those minerals and vitamins and antioxidants and kind of that health benefit. But the amount that we're consuming, really, the health benefits are not going to outweigh. If you use a teaspoon of white sugar compared to a teaspoon of honey, the health benefits are not going to be that differential that we say you should only consume honey for health benefits. Honey is calorically dense, it's a high sugar food, and it should be consumed in moderation. Although honey is delicious and is a quote natural form of sugar, when we add it to things, it does result in added sugars. And ultimately, we want to be watching how much added sugar and how much kind of sugar in general we're consuming on the day to day. We know that consuming a diet that is lower in total sugars, including some of those sugars like honey, has better health outcomes than a high sugar diet. Even if honey is, quote, healthy, there is still that sugar impact. And we know that sugar still impacts your blood sugars. It can still impact diabetes, your heart disease, and liver, and all those other components of your body that we want to keep nice and healthy. Here is just kind of a little bit of chart. So this is the research article that I am quoting for the potential health benefits. So you can see here that they looked at conditions such as cardiovascular risk, your glucose tolerance, which is basically your blood sugar regulation, your cancer rates, your upper respiratory infections, and wound. And you can see here that you have the effects on that kind of arrow up and down, and that shows if there was a positive or negative effect. And so this was kind of a comprehensive review of several different articles. And this was an article that was published in 2023. So really does have some of the most recent research that is showing the potential health impacts. So we do want to talk about some safety considerations with honey. As Ryan said, honey is indefinitely considered safe from a food safety perspective. There are a couple things that might happen though with your honey that we want to address. So one of the common things that we often get questions for, you might see and you wonder if it's okay or not okay, is that my honey has hard chunks. Is it in it? Is it still safe to eat? And yes, so over time, honey can crystallize with age. Really, that is no kind of negative impact on the taste and the quality. It basically is just with age and exposure to oxygen, it tends to crystallize. The solution is basically you just need to warm that jar and the honey, it'll soften and kind of go back to the way it was before. The other consideration is that honey can go bad if it is contaminated or stored incorrectly. So, for example, if you use that same knife that you butter your bread in the morning, it has butter on it, and then you dip it into your honey jar, you are introducing potential contaminants into that honey jar. So, we do always recommend having a designated, often you'll see these little cute honey kind of drizzle things. Those are great that you just designate as kind of your honey spoon, but you do want to make sure that you are not contaminating and cross contaminating. You want to make sure that you keep your lid on tightly for your honey. We don't want to expose it to unnecessary air. And of course, storing it in a cool, dark location is going to be your best bet. If your honey does have visible mold due to contamination, or if it just smells off or fermented, then you definitely want to toss it. So if honey is stored correctly and you reduce and eliminate potential cross contaminations, honey can indefinitely really be safe to consume. We do have one big safety concern, though, when we are talking about the consumption of honey, is that it is recommended by the American Academy of Pediatrics and other national organizations that you do not give honey to children under 1 year old. This includes all forms. So it's not just fresh honey, but it's honey in baked products as well. This is because that we have a bacteria called Clostridium, which this may sound familiar to some of you. It really is the primary bacteria that can cause botulism. So Clostridium may be found in honey and can cause botulism. The reason that baked goods that contain honey are not safe is because that botulism is heat resistant. Therefore, when you bake something, if like one little tiny piece of botulism, one little tiny speck of bacteria is in that honey, when it bakes in muffins or breads or whatever, it is not killed. The reason that we as adults don't have a safety concern with honey is because generally speaking, the amount that is in honey is very, very low, and that our bodies can do a good job of kind of filtering it out and keeping us nice and safe. But with infants, their digestive tracts are just not strong enough. And so therefore they're at an increased risk. It really is kind of by the time they turn 1 that their digestive tract and all the bacteria, the healthy bacteria that is in living in their kind of GI tract to keep them healthy is starting to really become robust and serve that purpose of protecting and keeping them healthy. So that is the primary reason. So if you've ever heard not to give children honey under 1 year, this is kind of the reason why. Now, again, speaking, it's a low risk, right? You don't hear of a lot of cases of botulism from honey, but it is a risk that you don't want to take, especially for infants who are in a very vulnerable state as they're growing and kind of building their immune systems to begin with. So as I mentioned, we do want to prevent moisture and air from entering the container. So always store with the lid on tight and prevent air and moisture from entering, storing at room temperature and using that new utensil. Do not reintroduce germs or food into it. And don't lick that honey spoon and then dip it back into the jar because again, you have potentially reintroduced bacteria from your saliva and your mouth into that honey jar. So do not use the same utensil, don't double dip. Really make sure that you're keeping it nice and healthy so that you have a long shelf life of that honey. So with honey, we do want to consider some things. Purchasing raw honey when possible, really that provides the most nutrition impact. When we think about food in general, the more something is processed, the more potential that those vitamins, minerals, antioxidants, phenolic compounds have been destroyed in that processing period. So do try to purchase that kind of raw or more unprocessed honey when possible. And we want to focus on buying local. Now, we want to buy local for a couple different reasons. A lot of times people think that if you have allergies, oh, I should consume local honey because that'll help with my asthma. As we've learned that the honeybees go to the different plants and that's where they get their kind of good things that they bring back to make the honey. And therefore, we would think that we are building up some immunity to those. But the American Academy of Allergy and Asthma and Immunology, which is a big word, but it's basically looking at allergies and asthma. The current research doesn't show that honey is an effective treatment for allergenic rhinitis, hay fever, or asthma. What that means is that you don't go buy honey because you think it's going to cure your allergies. Not, the research doesn't show that. But there can something be said something to have local honey. You're supporting your local farmers and your local businesses. Maybe you have a neighbor that is growing honey, or maybe you want to grow it yourself. So we are supporting that local economy. We're supporting our local farmers. And right, it doesn't hurt that we are getting some of those local ingredients from our surroundings as well, right? That those natural components that are being put into that honey. So all that to say is don't go buy local honey thinking it's going to cure your allergies, but there is something to be said still about buying that local honey. You do want to avoid honey with some of those added syrups or sweeteners that just provides unnecessary added sugar and provides unnecessary ingredients into our already pure, delicious form of our honey. So one of the common things that people tend to think about and maybe want to do is they want to substitute honey in their baked goods or in culinary purposes in the kitchen. There are a few things to consider. It is not going to be a one-to-one substitution. Let's say you're making cookies and it calls for 1 cup of sugar. You can't just use 1 cup of honey. This is for a couple different reasons that I'm going to walk through. One, honey is sweeter than regular sugar. So our regular table sugar, honey is about 1.25 to 1.5 times more sweeter than our regular table sugar. So personally, like I'll like to add honey to things because often I feel like I can add less sugar. So instead of adding a teaspoon of sugar to my tea, I can add like a half a teaspoon or even just a quarter of a teaspoon of honey to make my tea sweeter. And I get more of that flavor, but I'm not using quite as much and therefore getting a little few less calories because that flavor, obviously honey, talking about all the different types that Ryan mentioned, can have a quite a unique and interesting flavor that is added to foods. So that's also another consideration is would that flavor of the honey that you are using be a good ingredient and would it complement your dish well? Honey has more water than regular sugar. So even though honey is about 18 to 17% water, we know that regular sugar in its dry crystallized form has less water because it's that dry form and not a liquid form like our honey is. So to go back, I guess, for that first bullet point, for 1 cup of sugar, you want to use about a half to 2/3 cup honey from a sweetness perspective. For reducing water, for 1 cup of honey, you want to reduce 2 tablespoons up to a fourth of cup of liquid from the recipe. So if your recipe calls for 2 cups of milk, you'll want to reduce that by about 2 to 4 tablespoons because that honey is providing some of that extra liquid that your normal sugar would not be providing. So you kind of have to experiment a little bit. This isn't a perfect science, and really cooking and baking are unique sciences, and sometimes it does take some experimentation to figure out what works for your specific recipe. Honey is a little bit more acidic than our regular sugar, hence also that shelf stable aspect of why honey can be stored on our shelf for a long time. Bacteria generally doesn't like acid, and so it helps to keep that honey nice and safe from bacteria. If you are using honey and you feel like your baked dish is a little more acidic or has a little bit different flavor than what you're used to using the regular sugar, you can add a little bit of that baking soda. And the baking soda, it's a basic component, and so it's going to reduce that acidity and kind of balance that out a little bit. And the last thing to consider is that honey burns faster than regular sugar. And so we generally recommend reducing our heat by about 25 degrees Fahrenheit. So if your cookies say bake at 350, we recommend setting your oven to 325 to prevent any burning that might happen, because that honey, the sugar, and the ratios of the fructose and the sucrose is different than our table regular sugar. Therefore, there's just a higher risk of burning. So preserving honey, that you will not find a recipe for home food preservation on canning, because guess what? It is shelf stable without having to go through any of that process of home canning without your normal water pressure canners. There are recipes that you will find for preserving different types of ingredients or foods like fruits and fruit sauces or jams and jellies. There are a lot of different recipes that will show you what that substitution is that you can make with honey. So if you want to use honey instead of table sugar in your fruit or fruit sauce, you can replace about half of the sugar with honey in your home preserved fruit and fruit sauces. And then your jams and jellies, if you are using a recipe that has pectin, there is a little bit more of a precise measurement that you need to follow. And so that is replacing 1 cup of sugar with 1 cup of honey. And that's for every 6 pints of your recipe. And then if you have a recipe with no added pectin, you can replace half of the honey, half of the sugar with your honey. So those are just a couple things. All the information on substitutions using honey in place of sugar when you're doing home food preservation can be found at the National Center for Food Preservation, which is where I share all of my information from when we talk about canning and food preservation. So to wrap up my portion of this presentation, I always kind of go through the recipes, and it's one thing to grow it or harvest it, but then if you don't know what to do with it, then you're still kind of struggling to make use of your hard grown or hard earned honey or fruit or vegetable or whatever it is. So to start, we are going to talk through a no knead cranberry honey walnut artesian bread. And so this is a really great recipe also for beginning bread people, because it's a no knead. So you don't have to worry about the kneading and kneading it long enough or not over kneading it. So you basically mix your ingredients. So you're going to start with mixing your flour, your instant yeast, and then you're going to add your salt and kind of combine that. You'll add your walnuts. And if you don't like walnuts, you could certainly use a pecan or a different type of nut. I do recommend using a lower sugar cranberries. Cranberries often have a lot of added sugar to them. If you've ever had a cranberry, if you put it in your hand just feels so sticky after. They do have 50% reduced cranberries on the market, 50% reduced sugar cranberries on the market, which are a great addition. If you are new to bread making, you do want to make sure that your water is at a good temperature. And so this is warm enough that it activates that yeast, but not too hot that it kills the yeast, and not too cold that it prohibits it from kind of blooming and growing. So that ideal temperature for our water is going to be 90 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit. You can go up to maybe 105, definitely no higher than 110, but I kind of like that 105 as my sweet spot, or 100 to 105 as that sweet spot. And then this recipe again uses our honey, the ingredient that we're talking about today. And so you're going to add some of that honey to your mixture. Our yeast does need sugar, and so that yeast is like us, it needs energy, and sugar provides the energy to the yeast. So you're going to add that honey as your source of food for the yeast to grow, and then just provides a nice sweetness. So there's the directions. Feel free to take a screenshot, and we will also send the recording out after, that you'll be able to get the recipe if you aren't able to capture it all right now. This is one of my favorite recipes. We made this last year for one of our food preservation classes, and it's a blueberry honey vanilla jam. So your traditional jams often use sugar, but this recipe uses honey. And so you have blueberries. This is a great recipe for the extra blueberries, and hopefully you have a lot if you watched our previous Dig Your Dinner webinars, and uses honey, bottled lemon juice. Anytime we're doing preservation of different things like jams, we always want to use bottled lemon juice from a safety perspective. This uses vanilla beans, or you could use vanilla extract if you don't have vanilla beans. And then it also has cardamom and teaspoon as optional ingredients. When I've made this, I did not include either of those, but I've also made it with cinnamon, and they're both delicious. The directions are right there. I'm not going to walk through these all, but basically, this is a no pectin jam. And so you do have to heat the mixture up to a certain temperature, and that's going to help those natural pectins found in your blueberries set. So it does take a little bit longer. It takes a little bit more babysitting than like your traditional jam, but I promise you it is delicious and is a great addition to have in as your one of your jams. Honey is a really great addition to vegetables to kind of just bring out some of that natural sweetness. So, adding it to any type of roasted vegetables, this recipe uses carrots, parsnips, and turnips and beets, and then sweet potatoes. But really, any combination of vegetables works well. I've done honey glazed Brussels sprouts, I've done honey glazed pretty much anything. So, the key with roasted vegetables is you do want to make sure that your oven is hot enough. So having it at that 450 degree, 425, 400 to 450, but really that 425 to 450 is going to provide that nice caramelization that we want to happen. The other key with roasted vegetables is you want them to be in the same size so that they cook evenly. And this recipe calls for fresh rosemary. If you don't have fresh rosemary, you can use anything else. If you have any other herbs, you are more than welcome to use those as well. And then you're just going to bake it for 15 and 20 minutes until it's nice and golden brown and you get that beautiful caramelization that happens when you roast your vegetables in the oven. And then the last recipe is a honey chili chicken. So this uses honey again as kind of our main sweetener that we're adding. This recipe also uses chicken thighs, but you could certainly use boneless chicken breast. You could use any type of chicken that you want. It uses a combination of soy sauce, chili sauce, has your red bell peppers, green bell peppers, and yellow bell peppers and onion. You can mix and match. Maybe you only have red bell peppers. Go ahead and just use the red bell peppers. Use anything that you have from that perspective. And then garlic. So there's really not a lot of other ingredients. You are going to use your honey, soy sauce, and chili sauce and lemon juice, garlic as a marinade. So you're going to kind of mix that together. You're going to want that chicken mixture to be setting for a little bit. At least 30 minutes is what we recommend for a marinade, but you certainly can go longer. It's just any less than the 30 minutes, you're not going to kind of get those flavors infused in the meat that you're marinating. And then you're going to cook for 15 to 20 minutes. You're going to kind of glaze that chicken with one more time with that honey chili sauce and add some of your veggies. And then you're going to cook it. And you want to make sure that that chicken reaches at least 165 degrees Fahrenheit. And with that, that is the end of my portion going through some nutrition and recipes. So, are there any questions on that information? Okay, well, we'll give it if you have a couple questions, go ahead and put them in the chat while Anthony kind of wraps up and talks a little bit about our next Dig Your Dinner webinar.
Okay, thank you, Chelsea. Yes, if you have any last minute questions here, feel free to throw them in the chat. Ryan is still here to answer those if you have any about production. Then, of course, Chelsea can answer your nutrition and cooking questions. Yes, we wanted to give a plug for the next Dig Your Dinner, which will be on February 18th. If you're not familiar, we're always on the third Wednesday of the month. And the next one will be perfect plums and peaches. So if you are interested in growing any of those types of fruits here in Northeast Kansas, feel free to give us another watch. And the registration is up online actually for that one and all of the upcoming webinars for 2026. We have the entire year planned out for you guys again, and lots of great, interesting topics coming up as well. Lots of fruits this year as well. So if you're interested in the fruit production side of things, in addition to vegetables, we'll be covering those. Also, if you are interested in the past recordings of the Dig Your Dinner webinars, they are all available on our YouTube page. So give that a search as well. It's Johnson County KSRE extension on YouTube, and you'll be able to find the entire playlist of, I believe we have over 20 different webinars now to watch. So lots of great goodies to watch there. I don't see any further questions coming through, so I want to once again thank Ryan and Chelsea, and thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you next time.